So we're making a course, an awakening course, and it has lots of different elements that we're bringing together into a kind of cohesive path. And part of that is that for each of the parts, we're collaborating together. There's 11 of us, and for each of the parts, a different person is kind of teaching it or writing about it, recording a video about it, embodying it, and sharing that. And we thought we'd start by exploring the concepts of deconstruction together. It's also cool because the course has kind of come from our collaborative efforts. So the course is like based on a system for modeling experience I've been developing for a while now, a couple of years, in different forms. And yeah, it takes lots of different forms, but has a tendency to be a bit nebulous and hard to grasp because that's just my style. And so you've kind of brought in a nice sort of a bit more of a like engineering-y mind to it, a bit more grounded in linear time, which is helpful for a lot of people.
For those of us who use linear time.
Yeah. And yeah, it sort of helped shape it into something that people can essentially do as a course that has steps in order. The steps build on each other in a kind of logical order, which, we figured would be helpful for people. So that's the kind of like the general overview. And then also, you're one of the boxes that you're teaching is the deconstruction box.
That's right.
And I think that we wanted to have a kind of conversation about it, which especially around sort of essentially some of the ways in which this model is different, because I think one of the interesting things is that you've done lots of Vipassana meditation in a kind of quite traditional Theravada Buddhist setting. And if anyone's interested in that, we recorded a whole podcast about that as well. So I'll put a link to that, which is talking about a very deep way of, I guess, approaching this box through a kind of Buddhist approach. And there's a way in which it's almost like wanting to incorporate the elements of that in this model, but it also includes other aspects of experience that aren't sort of traditionally explicitly welcomed or included in that context. So that's part of the conversation, is kind of like, how does this draw on that experience that you have? How is it different? So that's some of the things we might talk about.
Nice. I'm just looking at the map now. I guess one of the things that comes to mind for me is you spent quite a lot of time creatively thinking through how to organize and structure and sort of triangulate each of these 16 different boxes. It's like that's sort of the sort of map word, but like I guess it's almost like disciplines or like ways of seeing, or like doors to a deeper reality. I wonder if I think I'm curious to hear how deconstruction on this map, how it fits in. Like, I know when I'm looking at the map, I see that it is the intersection of mind and consciousness. And to use one of the phrases from the map, it is cultivating emptiness through the practice of investigation. I guess I'd be curious to hear you talk a bit about what those things mean, because it's true that I come from a fairly sort of classical Theravada Buddhist Vipassana perspective where it's very much about deconstructing. And I'm imagining that term means something a bit different, or at least doesn't have a complete overlap with what it is that you're referring to. And so I guess one of the questions for me coming in was like, is it that I'm being invited to teach Vipassana, or is it that I'm being invited to essentially speak more sort of intuitively on the topic of deconstruction as a spiritual path and discipline and approach? I don't think it's like an either or necessarily, but I think for me to sort of get a handle of what it is that you're really referring to, I imagine it's just nice to hear you talk a bit about sort of what that, because when I looked at the map, I sort of started to realize, oh, each of these boxes is sort of an enormous, I mean, each of the sort of very evocative and sort of enormous, sort of phrases yeah, fields, fields of experience, realms of experience. So it's almost like, yeah, what energetic portal or what, yeah, what field is being referred to for you in this quadrant on the map?
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think it's really nice to talk about how each one of these tiny little squares, boxes, is like an entire world that you're entering into. And especially it's almost like all of them is a whole world that can include all of the others as well. Yeah. It's almost like the whole, you can sort of pick one world as your focus, and then through that, like, visit all the other ones, but it will just give experience a certain tone, I suppose.
Yeah.
A part of the sort of ethos of this model is that these are all aspects of your experience that are already there. You're just kind of like noticing that they're there and connecting to them. It's not something that you're creating or some like external state that you're kind of reaching. It's just a thing that's like in process in you, and you're like connecting to it and understanding it and getting in touch with it, and like integrating it, bringing it into a part of the whole of your being, rather than it being something that's happening either in shadow or subconsciously or like outside of awareness. And in my experiences with deconstruction, there's just like a very natural process, which like an example of this is that when I was really, really deep in my experiences, there was a kind of a natural sort of ebb and flow between constructing all these like really big worldviews, ideas, ways of looking, or even not even just constructing, just kind of like getting in touch with a part of me that is in that habit energy or habituated towards looking in that certain way. And that being like built up almost like a house of cards was always the image. And then it was like at a certain point, the bottom card would be taken out and it would all just deconstruct. And it's almost like at that point, it's like you can just kind of like see through the emptiness of the ways that you look at the world. And that just sort of like building up, deconstructing is a kind of like natural part of the process of the way that we learn, the way that we see things, the way that we are, the way that we feel about things. It's just like part of our ebb and flow. And it's almost like helping people tune into some different aspects of that.
That all makes sense on a very sort of intuitive level as I'm listening to you. But I guess sort of my experience with the practice I've done, for example, is that it's like, right, by doing a very simple attentional exercise of basically just paying attention to the sequence of phenomena that are arising in your present moment experience, and enormous and often quite alarming depth of instability and sort of voidness emerges in a way that is profoundly counterintuitive and largely terrorizing when you first encounter it. I mean, it's like it's really stripping away the intuitive sense that there is anything solid at all, even to the most sort of microscopic, granular. It's almost like you're in a room and you're pulling up the carpet and you're like, all right, well, at least we can't pull anything else up. And it's like, oh boy, the floorboards are moving. And then it's like, oh boy, the floorboards are actually made of 99.9% space. Oh boy, the atoms are actually, it's like, it's like fractal of emptiness, which is, I'd say mostly pretty alarming, at least when you first encounter it. You sort of get used to it over time. But so like when you describe it, it sort of sounds very gentle and very sort of intuitive, and oh, you just sort of, you know, wake up to aspects of yourself. But I guess from my experience, it was like mostly like pulling fingernails. You know, it was really quite shocking, and and certainly extremely novel. Like nothing about it was expected, or yeah, essentially nothing about it was sort of, oh yeah, I saw that coming. You know, there was very little of that in my experience. So I wonder how that sort of fits with what you're describing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, the House of Cards experience was having the House of Cards knocked down was hands down easily some of the worst experiences in my life.
Right.
Quite a large set of pretty bad experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, it's like really, really scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think part of this model is that it's shaped in an order where you start by building a level of you basically build up. So you start at the body, build up heart, mind, soul. And this is in the mind layer.
Yeah.
And if you build presence in the body first, and then openness in the heart, and you're connected and in a supportive environment, once you get to the deconstruction phase, it's less I mean, it's still shocking and still hard, and still there's nothing takes away the fact that basically the path is hard. I certainly don't want to paint any picture where it's like, hey, this is a really easy thing to do and you're just unlocking, like wake up to
just casually deconstructing the most profound assumptions you have about the universe. Like, no problem.
And
you
it's
just
lovely.
Feel that, you know.
But the point is that this is hard. This is probably the hardest thing people will ever do if they really commit to this path, and it's meaningful and it's worthwhile, and it's and these things open up spaciousness, capacity, things like that.
Nice.
But also that it has consideration in terms of like the order that you do things impacts the way in which they unfold, and if you the more of a solid base you have, the less likely you are to get into really disruptive spiritual territory. Yeah.
Nice. And what are some ways that I'm realizing you probably haven't done the sort of orthodox Buddhist thing in maybe quite the way that I have, but I'm curious, what are sort of some intuitive or directly perceived ways that you feel like what you're trying to point to is different from what's on offer through the Buddhist Vipassana path, for example?
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on this as someone who has more of a good view of the Buddhist part. But yeah, for me, it's like a wider remit, essentially. There's two things. One is that the emptiness is kind of the end of the Buddhist path.
I think that's largely true. Yeah.
It's almost like once you get there, you can some people it's like you're done. Some people it's like you can just endlessly cultivate more and more and more emptiness. Whereas this is more, it's like one aspect out of 16 aspects of experience, none of which are given priority. There's different hierarchies in the system. So there's a way that as you go up the triangle towards mind and soul, it gets like more refined and more complex what you're getting in touch with. But you could also equally say the other way, as you go down into heart and into body, it gets like deeper and sort of like there's kind of like, it's not that there's no hierarchies, but it's that there's no like ultimate thing that we're saying, oh, this is the final thing. And I think that's just more true. It's more like reflective of experience, that emptiness is a quality, but it's a quality that's like soulfulness or presence or openness. It's like one thing of many things that you want to cultivate. It's not like a final truth. So that's,
Yeah.
I think that in that, with that context, it's just more sort of sane, I think, than the kind of claiming a sort of final truth.
Right.
And then, yeah, the other aspect is that in the context of deconstruction, it's almost like having a broader remit of what that means and how it can be applied. So it's not just like me sitting in silence looking at my phenomenological experience. It's more like deconstruction is a process that's moving through us. And I think I was just thinking, like, a really nice example of this is, I feel like we do this relationally a lot. We do a lot of deconstruction. And I think it's kind of quite natural to us because we've both just done a lot of this practice, but just the way in which we talk things through and show up with each other, and we can sort of like take things apart and kind of, you know, take the engine out and take all the bits apart and look at it and do that sort of thing. Like, there's a way that the remit can be broader and more inclusive of a wider way of being with experience or something.
So when I'm hearing you, I think the two things that stand out or sort of the two things I take away from what you're saying is, like, one, it's recognizing that deconstruction is like we said earlier, sort of one of several portals in. It's not like sort of, I think you're right to say that in certain Buddhist schools, emptiness sort of is like the golden calf or something. It's like it's the, or whatever that metaphor is. It's sort of like the end of the road. And the other thing is, what I'm hearing you say is, it's not just literally sitting on a cushion and sort of, watching your phenomenological experience dissolve, but like one of my teachers in my travels, he would often talk about mental flexibility. And I feel like, in a way, that's partially what I hear you say. I mean, you said to me that you feel like I have a sort of an unusual capacity to have mental sort of flexibility and dexterity, even sort of in the heat of battle, or which is funny because it's true that I'm not conscious of that particularly. It's more just like the notion that there's a fixed perspective to see something has been utterly stripped from me. That just doesn't make any sense to me anymore. And so it sounds like it's almost like the like negative word is deconstruction, and like the positive word is like flexibility. It's like it's like that emptiness quality. It's like really introducing a level of multiple perspectives being the only truth, rather than, sort of the norm of being there's a right or a wrong or a black or a white or whatever. So I guess it's like, I guess what I hear you pointing to is that deconstruction, this box deconstruction, refers to, not just the kind of the most subtle and refined level of phenomenological deconstruction, but also just, basic capacity to sort of deconstruct cultural frames and political frames and financial frames and interpersonal frames and collective frames. And like, really, it's like using the full capacity of, what in shadow work they call like the magician energy. It's like really using like good magician energy to really sort of take perspective, zoom out, zoom in, to take multiple perspectives and recognize the sort of relative validity of different ways of seeing, and bringing that into sort of more holistic life practice that's both done on the cushion and off the cushion.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, nice. Are there any other specific sort of practices out there in the world that you feel like, other than Vipassana, that you feel like do this really well, or take a stab at this?
I'm sure there are. I think part of the course is that we want to kind of really think deeply about some places that we can point people.
Totally.
There is a way that I think that Vipassana has really like nailed a lot of this aspect of experience. I think of all the boxes, it's like one of the worlds which is the most, I guess we just talked about the ways in which it can be wider, but the practice is just very, like Vipassana practice, just very refined, very complete, very well maintained tradition that is
I think there are a lot of kind of course run-on effects of doing deep practice, where it's like, yeah, just the way you see is just transformed, and it's kind of hard to go back. And I guess there is a lot of work around integrating and reflecting and blah blah blah, because there was certainly a time where when I was practicing very deeply, it was like the only lens I saw through was through the phenomenological one, and that was sort of like the sort of the main authority in my way of seeing. And then just spending time doing relational practices and being in relationship and meeting the world and realizing like this isn't quite working all the way, like realizing that you sort of had to broaden my scope a bit. So I guess from that perspective, I hear that this box is really meant to sort of get all of that. And I agree with you. I think Vipassana is an unusually efficacious, precise, expedient sort of practice to sort of do this deconstruction process. I'm aware that there's like like self-inquiry comes to mind, like inquiry in the well, if you're more traditionalist, then like the Advaita Vedanta approach, and if you're like maybe less a traditionalist, maybe like the Jed McKenna approach, like but really using the sharpness of the inquiring mind to deconstruct concepts, norms, ways of seeing. I think Tibetan philosophy, like Madhyamaka philosophy from the Mahayana and Vajrayana schools in am I saying that right? Well, definitely Mahayana, maybe Vajrayana schools in Tibetan Buddhism does this extremely well. I mean, their monks will spend a decade plus doing just the philosophical look at deconstruction, and then only sit down on the cushion and really do emptiness practice. And like I personally didn't choose to do it that way, but I can certainly see. I mean, some of these teachers who I met with, their ability to do this, mental gymnastics makes it sound too glib, like to really profoundly be able to see through the trick of solidity in so many different ways and perspectives. It felt pretty magical to see that in real time. Like it was very much it was quite an inspiring and amazing experience. So that comes to mind as well.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, super nice. I think when you're talking about the wider ones as well, there's a way it's almost like when you adopt the frame of deconstruction being a world that includes all the other boxes or all the other aspects.
Right.
I can think about, like in more the sort of authentic connection box.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really nice book about how to have difficult conversations, which is kind of talking about relational, basically holding multiple perspectives and making space for everyone for that to be drawn out, and like which bits are important to stay connected to and how you can negotiate with your feelings and all of these things. And
beautiful.
If I think into like the subtle body aspect, it's like really being in touch with the energies of a conversation or an interaction or a feeling. It's like that can just really kind of like overwhelm the perspective of the mind and just sort of deconstruct everything you thought you were looking at. You're suddenly like just looking at some energies shifting around in a room or like feeling that. So there's kind of like all the different aspects can be like received through the sort of primary filter of deconstruction, or however you want to kind of phrase that.
Yeah, really nice. Well, I think mostly for me it's helpful to get a sense of what it is that you're pointing to intuitively with this sort of box and sort of what aspects of what I know to sort of emphasize, to sort of meet the because that's the difference, is that when you're doing Vipassana, you're really, I mean, many are doing it more or less in isolation. It's sort of a complete path, and it's like in this model, it is very much interdependent, interconnected, interrelated path. And so it's like almost like looking at like what are the adjacent boxes saying, in what ways are they saying something slightly different, and if so, then how to kind of really zoom in on what's essential for this particular aspect of practice within a sort of broader holistic whole. So that's quite nice.
Fun.